So what we did for our programming in Egypt is that we shifted some money that was already going to go in some directions with the previous government, and sort of announced an annual program statement for work, where we, instead of having a narrow request to do something very specific, what we did was we through our conversations with civil society announced 5 areas that we wanted to work with them. And we sort of are soliciting open proposals. So if you're a civil society organization in Egypt, you can just come to us and say, we'd like to do this, which is a very different, we'd like to do a certain kind of programming, which is very different from a sort of a more narrow form of programming where the U.S. government says, outlines in tremendous detail the work that will be done in advance. And our 5 areas of focus are, number 1, civic engagement. And we believe that's just very important for Egyptian NGOs to take a lead in defining what civic engagement means. Number 2, elections and political processes. Again, for NGOs to be involved in the electoral system. For number 3, access to justice and human rights. Number 4, transparency and accountability. And number 5, civic participation, which we can talk about later, we see as a little different than civic engagement. And again, we're inviting Egyptian NGOs to propose projects to us for as little as $75,000. That's a very different way of doing programming than the perception in the past of large multi-million-dollar projects being run out of Washington. So that's a new direction that we've taken for our programming in Egypt. And we've done the same thing in the economic growth category as well, and we can talk about that later. We see our work, again, in this regard as sort of a new direction for us. We see our work in this regard as really driven by a sense of what we all, everyone in this room, saw on television, or maybe if you were in Egypt, you may have seen live in the streets. And what we want to do is find a way to engage with and capture the energy of the sort of Egyptian people, Egyptian civil society, and there's a real desire, I think, in this administration to see that the transformation in Egypt is an Egyptian citizen-led process that will take Egypt to a new place and a new era, and we hope will really be just a tremendous a transformation for Egypt, and that we hope echoes throughout the Arab world, where we hope in the future to have partners in the societies and governments that are increasingly participatory and increasingly democratic and increasingly good neighbors for all. So I'll leave my remarks there. I've got a whole lot I can discuss, and I hope that we have a vibrant discussion afterwards, and I leave the floor to my colleague. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I was asked by Middle East Institute to come in and talk about how IRI as an NGO working in Egypt sees the priorities. So I wanted to discuss that with you. But I thought before I did, I would tell you a little bit about what we've been doing in the country before the events of the January 25 revolution. IRI started programming in Egypt in 2005 when President Mubarak said he would hold presidential elections as opposed to the referendum he had used in the previous times. And although IRI was not given official credentials by the Mubarak government to observe the election, we did take in a team of Arab leaders, European political activists, and some American activists to the presidential and both sets of the parliamentary elections to assess what we saw. And we also supported USAID's efforts at that time to support domestic monitoring through Saad Ibrahim's Ibn Khaldun Center. We did that. We produced a report about the presidential election in Egypt in 2005. We presented it on the Hill with actually Embassy of Egypt panelist with us. We proposed some things that might make for better elections in the futures, and it seemed to be a positive relationship at the moment. But by 2006, early 2006, we were told that IRI and NDI would no longer be allowed to work in the country pending completion of our registration process as an NGO. And I can tell you that as of today, in 2011, we still don't have that registration, and we actually don't really know who to talk to about it anymore in the Egyptian government. But in 2006, we were told, you need to stop work. We considered that, but when I went into the country to look at what would be involved in us stepping aside, we were told by Egyptian activists that the departure of IRI and NDI would be very demoralizing to them, and they encouraged us to stay, even though it looked, questionable as to what we could do. But we decided to stay, and as a result of that, state-controlled media began to attack us somewhat regularly. Also, our staff, our expatriate staff in the country, were subjected to sort of ongoing low-level petty harassment at airports and at our offices. And so in 2007, what we did is we started taking Egyptians out of the country to neighboring countries where we could do this training unimpeded. We call that an offshore program. And so we started taking Egyptian activists to Amman. We went to Dubai and to Morocco, depending upon the subject matter, to provide the training of the sorts that we would have been doing inside of Egypt under the USAID grant we've been operating under. Very often, the folks who went with us overseas to these other countries were questioned as soon as they returned home by the police, and actually a few National Democratic Party, President Mubarak's party, some of his activists came to the training, and they faced censure when they returned home in one or two cases. Still, we were able to conduct some degree of training since 2007 until November of last year, We were able to train over 1,000 Egyptian activists on things such as political campaigning, social media, and then we also did a lot of NGO capacity building to try to support them in both their internal organization and also their outreach to the international community. When I went to Egypt in February of this year, a lot of the activists that we have trained through the years were very much a part of what happened in January. And one of the things they said to me immediately upon my arrival was, IRI, NDI, U.S. government, you've got to stop doing it the old way. You need to start conducting as much training, as much technical assistance as you can in country so as many people as possible can participate. So actually in February, we did start training around the country. We started bringing in people from other countries as well as the region, people who were experts in things such as voter targeting, communications, media, and civil society. And so we have started training both the established parties and the unregistered parties. We've been working with the new groups that are proto-parties, nascent parties in development still. And we have begun training outside of Cairo, which has also been a big step for us. So that's basically where we've been and where we are at the moment. As to the priorities for U.S. government assistance in Egypt, let me just say that what I really see as probably the key priority at the moment would be support to the technical election processes. I'm sure that you were looking at the recent constitutional referendum, and while I think we can see some positive things that came out of this constitutional referendum, I think there were also a lot of problems that if this had been a candidate election, we would have seen this as a very negative thing. It would have probably come apart. There were shortages of ballots. There was little privacy for people to vote. There was a question about the training capacity, the ability of the local election workers. And these are all going to be very big issues when we come around to September, when we see the parliamentary elections.